This is a lecture that shows 4 projects that all deal with a certain way of creating attractions or activators for cities. And they are projects who somehow go in 2 directions when we talk about tourism and local stimulation. They are projects that are kind of dedicated to a local audience, at the same time being an attractor to visitors, tourists, and maybe also investment from outside. And the other one, the other direction is basically a relationship between the history or the heritage of a certain place and a vision for the future. So creating kind of bridges in 2 dimensions. And the project I'm showing today are from temporary projects to permanent, let's say, interventions or stimulations for cities or city parks that are still or were part of kind of an empty or forgotten area of a city fabric and now transformed into a new stimulus for center cities. So the first project I'm showing today is a temporary project for the city of Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe is celebrating its 300th anniversary this year, and this is the castle with the center of this radial grid that Karlsruhe is famous for. It's kind of the icon of the city. It's a city planning 300 years ago with the monarchy sitting at the very center with a tower, and you have all these streets focusing to that power focus. The park behind is a royal garden, and it's a landscape, English landscape design that is protected. We built another project, and I don't know if I can show this here. Oops. Here, this is a dining hall that we built a couple of years ago, which is on the one of the last accesses towards the forest. And then this is the site, actually just behind that tower in the garden. We started a competition with this kind of icon of Karlsruhe, which is this grid with the focal point, a very kind of monocentric idea of the world, and use that grid as a starting point to think, what if this was the grid 300 years ago, the understanding of power in society, how would that actually look today, or how could that be transformed into a version of today? This is the pavilion, all made in timber, that was opened about a month ago. This is the concept. So the central idea, the circular idea of Karlsruhe, confronted with a grid that actually, at that point 300 years ago, is focusing to this one center tower. Now we actually distorted the grid into let's say, focus points that talks much more about democracy today or individual goals and individual perspectives in our current culture. And then located behind the castle, you see a circular, or let's say a spheric envelope being pushed and distorted, so it creates a view from the lake, which is a kind of an important viewing access towards the tower from the back through the garden. And it allows for certain rooms inside, creating a concert room or an exhibition space, have a stage, and also creating an outdoor area for events and concerts. So this is at one point the moment when there was a piano concert at night, so it works at night, and this is how it sits there waiting to be activated. There is a possibility to go up and have terraces to overlook the garden, and also have smaller readings, smaller spaces for art installations, for maybe screenings or small concerts. You see that it's not so easy to see, but you have these kind of stairs and steps going up, and then there's the big hall on the underground, and then the opening towards the garden. So you have different zones of activation, or different zones of celebrating these 300 years, and this is the main opening night with these beams into the air. And somehow, this is a coincidence, it takes the idea of the grid in these beams into the endlessness, into the sky. And here you see the view of the pavilion with these grids going up and beyond the certain limits of the site and the city. some detailing also. It's all timber, and this was part of the, let's say, the selling point of our project, but also the city, who is of course cautious that, you know, when these kind of projects are constructed and realized, there is also concern about sustainability, being responsible, using the money, the public money, the tax money for these kind of projects in an intelligent way. So we were collaborating with a timber company from Augsburg, and the timber that we used is brought by the timber company. It's actually, it's not a public-private partnership project, but the company got the whole package, which means that they were coming into the competition with a design, which was ours. They would be in charge of building the pavilion, also bringing the infrastructure for it, and also dismantling it after. So it's a whole process of building and dismantling. And so the beauty of this project is that the timber that we are using is brought back into the normal production process of their wood products after the 4 months while this project is standing there. And also trying to be quite efficient and simple with the detailing, so it's also easier to dismantle. Here's some ideas how these lights were cut into the timber. This is how the building kind of deals with a special lighting where you have a grid that's dark in the front and a lit big in the back, so there's kind of a depth also created with it. And this is the German president and the minister from Baden-Württemberg, which is the southern part, and the mayor of Karlsruhe, so that was also an important moment where it became kind of in the state attention during the visit of these important politicians. But I also find it interesting, this is how glamour looks in Germany compared to other countries. Down to earth. Another view from the like the stage area. All these pieces here, this looks like trash, but it's not. It's actually designed by students from the design school in Karlsruhe. They are meant to be puzzles that are kind of carried around in the park. They try to bring them back together during certain events, and then they're taken, you know, by people back. Some of them are stolen, which I think is actually a nice idea. The colors are the colors from the logo. So I don't know. You're hearing that, you know, there's a lot of, let's say, ambitious on the organizational part, and then it also falls apart in other parts because there's such a dynamic, such an intense, let's say, organization necessary for these 3 months of organizing the City Jubilee of Karlsruhe. The ZKM, which you all might know, the Center for Media and Art, is doing, you know, fantastic exhibitions, also public art exhibitions in the city. They have about 400 events and concerts and parties and talks in this pavilion until the end of September. So it's really a very complex logistics project. So if this is a temporary thing to activate and create attention for the city of Karlsruhe for a very specific moment in the history of Karlsruhe, and it takes all that kind of celebrational tools and media to show the world that this is an important place. It's a place of innovation. It has fantastic universities. It's one of the important locations for, let's say, democracy in Germany in terms of history, but also we have the Verwaltungsgericht in Karlsruhe, which is kind of the highest court we have in Germany. So it's a center for political power and democratic power, and therefore an important city. This is a project in Berlin, completely different in its location, but also somehow deals with ideas of attraction of foreigners and tourists, at the same time becoming, let's say, an important building or center for a different form of urban exploration or celebration of activity and life inside of the city. It deals with certain issues of nature and artificial nature in the city, so there's a certain bridge of countryside or nature experience kind of artificialized into an urban context. If you know the place in Berlin, it's the Alexanderplatz on the top, then you have Alexa, this long thing, the S-Bahn, the elevated train running down here, and you have the light spot, which is until now a parking spot or the place for Christmas fairs. Also the Barbie house was located on that site. So it has a certain, let's say, attention and people know where it is, but it's still one of the deserted areas in the center of Berlin. We won this competition a little bit more than a year ago, and now we are in the planning phase. It's a cluster for brands and experience. That's how it's called by the developers. It's called Volt. It talks about a certain energy, a certain, let's say, activity center that's gonna happen here. And it also deals with different layers of infrastructure in the city which become important for the spatial layout of the building. So you have the elevated train on this side and this opening on the same level, so there's a visual connection. We enter from this plaza, the ground floor, and there's the subway running diagonally through it, so you also experience that in the inside. We have a hotel on the top, so there's a view towards, let's say, the sky and the tower of the Alexanderplatz. So there are different layers of sections in the city that are all experienced from different activities inside the building. And here are some, let's say, conceptual drawings where you see these clusters of different brands, products, experiences, smaller, let's say, units of different forms of display, different forms of atmospheres coming together, creating this dense block, which then has this energy cut or energy horizon running through, creating this gap, which is then a more open floor plan inside these clusters. And you see how they relate to the S-Bahn. There is the tower of the Alexanderplatz. You have the hotel, shopping, and the subway running underneath. Different activities that are a surf wave, for example, or an indoors flight tunnel. There are different forms of stages and performing areas. Here you have the subway running through. This is the view towards the elevated train, the view to the Alexander Tower. It's a cluster that defines different forms of urban restructuring, for example. There are these blocks that are given by the city planning. There's a little square that creates two entrances, one to Alexa and to us. And then from here you have the GDR urban planning with these apartment slabs that are more of an open green city understanding of an urban fabric. In this elevation, you see again the cut that runs through these different brands that can be read from the outside. The city somehow tries to reduce that effect of the indoor display towards the outside by telling us to, or telling the developer to create a building that's kind of quieter to the outside and uses more of the energy and the display in towards the center of the building. This has to do with certain effects to neighbors, of course, with light and with a certain aggressiveness of displaying and advertising. At the same time, it also supports the idea of a dense, activated, energetic, dynamic interior, which needs to be explored and creates a strong division or a different experience from inside and outside. On the level of this horizon line, you have the surf wave here and the indoor skydiving over there, creating also different forms of open floor areas that are possible for pop-up stores that can be thematically changing over the year, from a Christmas market to a special, I don't know, soccer world games, a theme world towards maybe a harvesting event, and that's health food related to sports and activities. So it also creates different attentions and changes the way the building offers certain products. This is the surf wave, and Jochen Schweitzer, who is the investor and also the company who is running this, is very famous for bungee jumping. They're doing these surf waves in Munich, also at Munich airport. You might see that sometimes underneath this big atrium. And it seems to be a success that's working. This is the first wave that they're bringing into the center of a city and creating this nature experience as an urban experience. This is then the view of the main atrium with these different stages and activity platforms. And you see these two guys flying there. This is the indoor skydiving, which is a circular glass cylinder where you have air coming from underneath up, and you're flying like 3-4 meters height for a minute or two, kind of simulating parachuting or jumping out of a plane. And this is the view from the back. So this will happen in the next 3 years, and we will see how that really works. But you can see how a building like this works as much as a local, let's say, component of activating a certain part of the city. At the same time, you can already see the whole social media connection between experiences there, hanging out, meeting friends, taking pictures, and communicating that, towards, your friends and your network. So it's, as much as it's a local place, it's an international or mediated place at the same time. Different in terms of its nature are projects we are doing in Georgia. And Georgia, as you can see, is at the eastern end of the Black Sea, somehow a transfer country from Azerbaijan towards the west, either through Turkey or through the Black Sea towards Europe. And this transit is one of the biggest, let's say, qualities or the biggest economic values that Georgia has, besides being an extremely beautiful country, and a little bit of steel production or steel industry as well. There's fantastic food. It's famous for its wine, and it was somehow the agricultural production hub for the Soviet Union. All that kind of fell apart when the Soviet Union fell apart, and the country had to open up more towards Europe. This was also the idea of anchoring the city, anchoring the country, and also its dynamic investment into infrastructure as part of, let's say, West-oriented modernization of the country. So these lines through the country, they're building now the first highway, for example, or new train tracks that all go east-west through the country, a new port, which is important, a coastline that is now also developing in tourist resorts with a lot of 5-star hotels being developed. There's gambling, there are beaches, there's alcohol, there's maybe girls. It's all, that's possible in a Christian Orthodox country compared to the Muslim countries around. So it attracts a certain tourism which is not necessarily the western part of Europe, but it has this kind of interest or this kind of tourist segment that is important for Georgia. And all these investments are only working if there is a certain infrastructure that is from police to normal urban town administration, to train tracks, to border stations, to rest stops along the highway. All important keystones that will make this country run as a normal country as we know it, and therefore providing and supporting the economic success of Georgia. We also might have the situation that people who only transfer through the country might see only the architecture that's along these lines of transportation, and that's why the government said all these architectures along these lines are important cultural places, because that's the image that we are leaving with people when they're going through our country. So we were one of many architects who were invited to be part of that transformation of the country, and all the blue dots that you see here are potential or already realized projects that we were involved with in Georgia. So it's from Batumi, which is this big kind of booming city on the Black Sea coast, Sarpi, which is south, which is the border station to Turkey. You have Lasika, which is the planning for a new town, now stopped, but it might re-happen again, a new port at the Black Sea coast. Mestia in the high Caucasian mountains, a small, really cute, UNESCO-protected site that is transformed or wants to be transformed into a place for hiking, but also for skiing. Very difficult to get to. It takes about 9 hours by car, or there's a small airport and you fly there, but only when it's really beautiful weather, otherwise you can't fly there. Then here from Tbilisi to the Black Sea coast, you have these lines and dots. This is the new highway, and part of it is already built. We are building a couple of rest stops along these routes. Then there's a train station in Ahakalaki, that is an international train station, but only international because the train tracks between Turkey and Georgia are different, so each train has to be transformed onto a different train system. It has high security. All the products have to be reloaded. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in a high mountain plateau, but a huge train station because of these issues. So I'm showing you all these projects that we were involved with, and kind of all smaller projects, but it works as an acupunctural activation of the whole country. And these projects sometimes happen in very remote areas to show that the change of or the modernization of the country and administration not only happens in the big cities or in the capitals, but each part of the country is affected and profits from this change. So this is a cafe and a structure with a public screening that was built in Batumi. We were surprised that they built it because we didn't really hear that the construction happened, but we were invited for the opening. And this was a little bit of a bumpy start, but from that moment on, it really became a very successful and a very productive collaboration. So here you have the cafe and the sculpture, which was a screen in the very center. Everything else that you see here came in the next 2 or 3 years. You have a Kempinski Hotel, you have a Hilton, this is a university tower, then this is a viewing tower with the bowl where you can go up and have a restaurant up there. So it's all, I think, not older than 3-4 years. That's what you're seeing here. Somebody also liked our sculpture so much that they echoed it on the facade, which is maybe a nice form of congratulating. And then a little south of Batumi, we have a border station. And I think this is one of the most significant pieces of where architecture and borders are setting the tone for how you're dealing with your neighbors, how you're dealing with visitors, how you're saying hello and how you're saying goodbye to somebody who is coming to your country. Georgia runs until here, and then this is all Turkey. And again, there's a certain vision that I thought was quite unique. This border station, of course, is a border station, but it's also a place to meet. So instead of celebrating, or let's say, or enforcing the idea of like control and dividing between two countries, here the Georgian government understood the building as a place to meet, as a place to come together, to create places for conferences and meeting areas, plus terraces to overlook to the Black Sea. You have the beach that really runs all the way to the border. You can swim really until Turkey starts, and you have a quite important, also leisurely atmosphere, which is the beginning of the country once you enter it from Turkey. We have also meeting rooms and conference rooms on top of the checkpoints. This is where you can rent, for business meetings or maybe even a family gathering. There's a lot of shopping, of course, which is all what we know related to border stations and custom areas. But then there are also these terraces that you can overlook, use to hang out and also overlook the Black Sea. This is a view from the conference rooms towards the Black Sea. This is a view at night. And again, another view at night. So this anchoring, or that kind of relationship between two hands reaching to each other, is part of what we translated into an architectural gesture. Okay, Mestia. And Mestia is 1,007 meters high in the Caucasian Mountains. As I said before, it's very difficult to get there. Now there's a new road, so the time was cut from 9 to 6 hours more or less. But there's also a small airport that we built, 280 square meters. You can see it sitting there, kind of lonely along this new runway, and you see the mountains behind it. You can only fly in there going through a saddle in the mountains, and if there's no cloud or very little clouds, you can do that. So there's, I think, 3 or 4 times a week a flight from Tbilisi to Mestia, if there's good weather. So this is the tower that has like 3 wings. One is going up as the tower, one is the cafe, and the third one is that kind of the boarding checking area. You have the old stone towers of Mestia, which is the UNESCO part of Svanetsia. These towers were protection towers or storage areas for the people, in former times, and that's what's so unique about this place. Our tower relates with these dimensions to these old towers. The other areas of the airport, the seating area here or the checking part on the other side, are all playful variations of that tower idea. And maybe a propeller. There's also a small town hall that we are building, reinterpreting the existing old timber frame houses. This is how then they turn it into a night view. And a police station that we were also building. So these public institutions were important to also show that there's a change, mostly in the police administration, from being a totally corrupt system to kind of a high-profile profession by, getting rid of unlawful behavior of politicians also, but also for policemen, creating a certain transparency and a modern appeal of the police system itself. In Gori, we were building two rest stops. Gori is the hometown of Stalin, so it has a certain, let's say, importance in the history of the Soviet Union, and also is known as a place, for visitors, but also, of course, for locals. This rest stop was built with the high-rise, with the highway, but there are also other rest stops built where no highway is built yet. That might take a couple of years. But important with these rest stops is that they are not only gas stations and maybe a small coffee shop. There are also supermarkets. They have a local farmers market. They have an arts and crafts market, and maybe a small exhibitions for the local culture that is around. So it's the first time that actually supermarkets are happening in Georgia. Until now, you only had very small shops, local food production, maybe expired M&Ms and Twix and sweets. So it's something that really brings a normal, or let's say, a shopping experience or a supply infrastructure as we know it and as we find it so normal and comfortable into areas that haven't really been exposed to, that haven't really profited from fresh products, from let's say comfort products that we all seem to celebrate and at least take for granted. So these new rest stops here are activators for the whole area, and at some point also the highway, of course, is coming. So again, it's a bridge between the local culture and the local economy as much as the transfer culture that is defining Georgia. These are some views. You see the stages here for the local farmers and for arts and crafts. Then there's the supermarket and there's a cafe, of course. A view from the other side. This one was built with Georgian Oil Company and Georgian Construction Company. That's all on-site concrete. And then on the other side of the street we were working with an Azerbaijan oil company, which is this one here, and built with a Turkish construction company. This is all a steel structure with prefabricated cast concrete panels or elements that are put onto the steel frame. So even each project somehow had different collaborators on the Georgian side. We were dealing with different forms of intensity of communication between us and also the local architects and local engineers. Very interesting dialogue. We learned a lot from them and how to read construction methods and translate architecture into local productivity possibilities. If we are in Germany, for example, always confronted with extra costs once we want to make a curve, the formwork costs such and such more. That's, for example, not an issue in Georgia because in manpower, takes that in, and it's just another way of doing something, but it's not necessarily an extra cost factor. So local, let's say, handcraft construction in that way also gave us a lot of possibilities to do things differently than what we were able to do, for example, in Germany. And this is another view from the highway to the mountains. When we had the opening, we were told that 2 couples already asked for having their wedding festivities after the celebration in the rest stop, in the cafeteria of the rest stop, which I thought was quite of a compliment, and shows also the urgency of these kind of new forms of architecture and new kind of spaces to experience a change and, let's say, a view towards the future of this country. And yeah, I think that happened actually, but I never saw pictures. And the last project I'm showing from Nasica is a tower that we were building, also announcing the start, a new kind of energy, a new stimulus for the country, building a port, because the now existing port in Poti is too small and actually it's quite flat. The Black Sea has a very shallow coastline, so to enter really into ports with bigger boats is quite difficult. So in Nasica there was a chance to build a deeper port, and using that as a chance to develop a whole new metropolis for about 500,000 people. The new government stopped the development, but you never know, it might actually pick up again in 2 or 3 years if there's a new change or a new government coming up. We were asked to build, let's say, the marker for this new development, which is this sculpture sitting now a little bit lonely in the Black Sea. There's a small hotel from the 80s, like a sports youth hotel that you see here in the front. There's a swamp behind it, which now has a boulevard, I think 4 lanes in one direction and 4 in the other direction, with 2 huge roundabouts. There's a small town hall here by Architects of Invention from London, Georgia, London. But that's basically it, that's what happened. And I think it's a marker for an extreme interesting development that happened during the times of Saakashvili, which was like plus 11% growth every year. And with the new government, it went to basically -1 within a couple of months. So you can see how vision for opening it up, creating certain moments of attention in the country, also attracts economic, let's say, growth and interest. And this is what architecture can contribute to the dynamic development of countries or certain locations. So here you see one of the towers views from the north. This is when you're on the bridge towards the water. There's a little fisherman sitting there trying to catch fish, and that's more or less everything that's happening there. When I was there, there were 4 students, architecture students from Poland visiting, which was kind of a nice surprise that in the middle of nowhere somebody is still touring around. And some use of the construction. It was all prefabricated or built in segments in Turkey, then shipped on the water to the coastline, and then put together on site and built up. So this is the last view of the Nasica Tower. And now let me jump to Sevilla, which is again a project similar to what we experienced in, at least in Karlsruhe and in Georgia in some parts, the relationship of contemporary architecture in an historic, important, let's say highly valued historic context, where this bridge of heritage or history towards a vision for the future has a dialogue that's really productive and seems to be working as an attractor for a local, let's say, identification and transformation of cities as much as international input. Here you see Metropole Parcel in the center of Seville. It was the site for the market until the 1970s. Then it was taken down because the city grew so much in the 20th century, so you couldn't feed the city anymore from this central part, and it was moved to outside. It's the largest medieval town center in the world, as we were told. You see the expo area on the other side of the river, but this is in '92, which is about 20 years now, and nothing really happened since that time, at least until mid-2000s when the competition was launched. You see a building, an institution sitting in this very dense fabric, similar to the cathedral or the bullfight ring or the town hall. It's always larger public buildings or institutions that are creating these spaces for gathering, for certain moments of celebrating communal life. And Metropole Parasol is one of these anchor pieces in this very dense fabric. You see Calatrava's bridge in the back, this is from '92. And then Metropole Parasol just kind of lifted out a little bit over the skyline of Seville. Here you have Metropole Parasol and different layering. There's a big roof, which we thought is the important, let's say, material that we can bring to the site, which is shadow. It's very hot, similar today here in Montenegro. It's something that you could experience as a very helpful means to allow to be outside and kind of celebrate urban life. There are certain programmatic elements that were important, but we have a sky view or a sky walk on top of it, overlooking the city. There's a restaurant and a cafe on the top, and in the lower areas you have different programs of archaeology and food market. You can see it's very central. It's sitting in the very heart of the city, where the city was founded in Roman times. So the main important passages through the urban fabric all meet in this place. And until Metropole Parasol started, the southern half of this egg-shaped fabric was quite developed. This is where the shopping happened. This is where the big institutions were, the town hall, the cathedral, the bullfighting, and so forth. The northern part was a little shady, not necessarily dangerous, but somehow, dark and empty. This completely transformed. This long white plaza that you see up there, this is now the hub for nightlife, for restaurants and bars and clubs. Everything that's north of Metropole Parasol is now called Soho of Sevilla, and has a lot of shops and cafes and vintage stores and so forth. So now this kind of bridge that was intended to bring the development from the south part into the north part really worked. This was one dimension. The other one was, of course, Seville wanted to compete with other Spanish cities who were successfully marketing or putting their name into the world by contemporary architecture like Barcelona or Valencia or Madrid. And then, of course, creating international attention for tourism, but also for economic investment, showing that there's a certain innovation capacity that Sevilla has. This was the situation when the competition was launched. You see the southern part, which is the part that was taken down from the market in the 50s to create this end line of the bus. The northern part was still running until the 70s. Then it became kind of ruinous, falling apart. The city moved the market outside of the city center and started to build a parking garage 4 stories into the ground. After building the perimeter walls and taking out the earth 6 meters deep into the ground, they found all these beautiful mosaics and ruins of and foundations of the Roman city, and decided to keep that as a window into the history of Sevilla. Everything was researched and documented and was available to us, so we knew exactly where we were able to actually do foundations and where we were not able to touch anything because of the Roman findings. This was the market as it existed for many years. It was never really a plaza with an empty open space. It was a cloister before, then the cloister became bigger, they had to take down more houses around it, then the cloister moved away, they built the market, they had to take more medieval fabric down. So the buildings around are small LA facades, all of a sudden being exposed to a larger space in front of them. But it's not like Plaza Mayor or Real, where the frame of the plaza defines the space. It's always actually the building or the institution that marks that location. This was the market here. Then for 30 years, when it was taken down, a parking lot, temporary parking lot. For the competition, we were exploring different ideas of the roof, the shadow that's important to create an atmosphere and a climate that makes it possible to be outside, at least in summer. Different heights, different undulations. all trying to figure out how to deal with this very heterogeneous frame of the plaza, and also to being respectful to some of the historic important monuments in the neighborhood. Then there were certain references that were important. For example, the big trees, that is a neighboring plaza where these Ficus Beniamini trees are building, we are building basically what was growing, as a very familiar element on the plazas. Then we have this beautiful undulated stone roof of the cathedral, also something like a flying carpet that you can echo or see kind of being echoed in our project. Or this structure as a space-defining element of the cathedral inside. The layerings of the program, again, the horizontal one, maybe similar to what you saw in the Volt shopping mall in Berlin. You have an underground view into the history, which is the archaeology museum. On the ground floor, we have some food and commercial areas. Then there's an elevated plaza for special events. And then on top, you have the walkway and the restaurant. The design happened actually the other way around. We started with the roof, and this undulated roof was the one that looked the most, let's say, relaxed and flexible in this location. And then we had to take down the loads and very specific points where we were allowed to go into the archaeology and have foundation. This is the archaeology museum on the ground. This is sections. It's 150 meters long, 30 meters high, and 75 meters wide. Everything you see here in beige is actually a timber construction as well. The dark parts are either steel or concrete because of earthquake or fire issues. We then translated this idea of the construction of the timber. This is not something we knew from the very beginning, but it was a solution that we found always by evaluating different parameters from cost development of materials. Steel was quite complicated in the mid-2000s because the Chinese market was buying all the steel and the prices were going up, and you couldn't really calculate steel prices for the next couple of years. Issues of fire behavior, extension and contraction with heat and cooling down at night, sound pollution during the construction site, prefabrication qualities, earthquake behaviors, sound in terms of wind, you name it, all kinds of like the parameters. And in 3 evaluation processes, the timber, which we use for building in Karlsruhe before, which is a laminated timber with the polyurethane coating, was always the one that kind of won the comparison in this quite complex matrix of decision making. So here you see some steps how to put these elements together. There are these laminated timber plates that are 7 centimeters. Each layer is either 3 millimeter or 1 centimeter, kind of compressed. Comes in plates 2 meter by 40 meters. You can cut out more or less the shapes you want. Another innovation that we brought into or developed for this site are these joints where you have these steel fingers running deep into the wood like forges, which are glued into the timber to translate the load or the forces from one element to the other. And this gluing into the timber is something that maybe makes this building one of the largest glued buildings or bonding technology buildings, constructions until today. And using a glue that was developed by Fraunhofer Institute just a couple of years before. So we had to test how the glue actually behaves if there's a fire, how the glue behaves in the extreme heat of Seville. We had to then temper the elements, the steel forges into the timber glued in had to be brought into a climate chamber, being heated up to 80 degrees to actually create another 10 degrees more in the performance temperatures for this construction method. So I think we actually saved for at least next 100 years of climate change. But it's something that you always have to keep in mind if you solve or invent certain new forms of construction. So here you see details of the drilling of these holes. This is the cross-section through the timber. You have this layered timbers, you have the steel rod, the glue around it, which transfers the glue much better than being screwed into the timber. And then you have the polyurethane coating, which creates the protection for the timber. The polyurethane coating also allows you to save load and wood. Normally, if you use wood as a loading material, you need 2 centimeters of wood on each side for weather protection or for weathering, and then the rest inside you can use as structural material. With the polyurethane coating, actually you can use the whole timber as a structural component, and then the 3 millimeters of polyurethane are doing the weather protection. So it was cost saving in terms of material, it was weight saving in terms of material reduction, and that again affected the size of the foundations and so forth. So even these details, small details, have a lot of effect on, let's say, the economic or the structural performance of a building. And so you see some pictures here of the production, these plates that are open to any kind of geometric cutouts, then the steel details being screwed in. It's kind of a rough method of construction. It's not like a high-tech version that you see in Foster or Roger. It's more of a, let's say, a rough form of assembling, which maybe is closer to this idea of the section cuts of this organic shape and the sticking together of the elements. Then the wood, was produced in Finland and Germany was brought to Seville. Then the polyurethane coating happened outside of Seville in a big hall, then brought onto the construction site, put together. These are the connection points, and you can imagine how the logistics of these different joints were quite a challenge. The engineers wanted about 40,000 different details, each according to the different loads on each part. The construction company only wanted to build 4,000 joints because that made it more economical. Of course, some of them are over-calculated, but this was constantly the battle between the engineers, the production, the test engineers, and the local company who was building it. Here you see some pictures from the construction site, the towers for the elevator and for the restaurant on top. Then there's this framework that looks quite old-fashioned, like in old churches, that you build up to then place the elements. And here you see the building in dialogue with the heritage of the site in terms of creating, let's say, the invention that was always important for us when we were asking, how does this really relate to Seville and to the historic, whatever, city center? And on one hand, it was these elements that I showed before, which are the trees or the cathedral and these kind of elements of architecture that we find important. But I think what is really the key factor for Seville and its importance in history, that it was the place of innovation for Europe, where a lot of influences of the Islam was transformed and affected the modernization of Europe. And this innovation capacity and this kind of redefining conventions and creating certain inputs is, I think, the more important part of history of Seville than just looking at these old buildings. And this is the anchor where we see the contemporary being relevant in terms of historic references. Here you see some of the night views, a view from the archaeology up into the sky. Shadow, which was the first element that we brought in. Here you see a photo from around noon. A little later, so at some point during the day it looks like this. It's a grid projected down. And a little later it might look like this. So also that shadow completely transforms during the day and changes the appearance of the plaza. When you look at it from the sky, this is what you see, kind of invisible, this very light grid, and only where you have the restaurant, that's when it jumps out of the city fabric. But you're on the ground, this is what you see, a very sculptural building catching your eye, creating a neat identity in the center of the city, in relationship to always the historic architecture. Some views also from neighboring buildings onto Metropole Parasol. It also works at night, I think, and in the rain. You see it here from the elevated plaza onto the neighboring cities and buildings, and you can see how it jumps and it's very irregular. Buildings from the 50s, but also buildings, a couple of 100 years old. And then you have small details like this one here, where we left them as a conscious decision to be very close to the digital design process. You have this north, south, east, west grid that's running, let's say, endlessly over the city of Seville. And everything inside the organic envelope of Metropole Parasol is then materialized into this grid, and everything outside is kind of an endless invisible grid continuing. So during the design process, we had to be sometimes more sensitive to the neighboring area. So we had to reduce or be more flexible. Then inputs from the structural engineers asked for more height here because we need more structural space, or less load here, so we had to reduce. So that envelope was constantly changing according, or massaged according to these different inputs. So sometimes elements like this would be outside or inside that envelope, and so sometimes they would appear, then they would disappear and go back and forth. So if you would design it just by hand, you would never design something like this, I guess. But in this process of being flexible and massaging that envelope constantly to these different forces, these are the results, and I think very important key factors to understand how the design process really worked. A view from the top with a sky view over the city. Another view, a night view. And you can go up until so after midnight, I think. Another view into the city and how it sits there at night. And now I'm showing you a couple of projects, pictures, how this building now got accepted by the city itself. And I think that's kind of now the success story of Metropole Power. So I think only because it was a very open competition system from the very beginning, where it wasn't named a realization competition, but an ideas competition, there was not the pressure to really find a realization for it or find a solution that can be realized. It was an anonymous international competition, and in the first phase, 10 projects were selected. Each of them had to come to, or we all had to come to Seville. We all had to present to each other, but also to the city, to the audience, to the people. Each project was available on the internet with all the drawings, all the texts. There was a blog, now we would call it blog. At that point, I think it was called guestbook. And people started to discuss these projects. So it was very open and transparent for everybody what were the different solutions here to be discussed. Some of them looked like a huge Centre Pompidou in the city of Seville. There was a proposal which was a very three-dimensional undulated green park, a minimal plaza with 3 high-rises, a kind of a fun palace, Cedric Price open structure, our project, and so forth. And ours was the one that was most successfully, or let's say enthusiastically discussed by the people on the blog, and that helped us, of course, to create energy and keep our input on a very high level, but also reading very carefully what people said about where we were not maybe sensitive enough to the neighborhood, or where we could actually push a little more. So this open forum, I think, was part of why something happened in the end, because after 30 years of being a temporary parking lot, the city really wanted to maybe find a solution or find a possibility to bring the very heart of the city back to life. And when we won, in this jury process, the city knew that it had support from the people. It was a moment, a window in the history of the last couple of decades where something could happen on that side again. So it happened. People were enthusiastic. Of course, there was also criticism, mostly from the Catholic people who also organized Semana Santa, because they thought this project would kill the history and the rituals and the old traditions of Sevilla downtown. Well, after a year, after the opening, it was on the cover of the program of Semana Santa, so it couldn't be so bad anymore. They realized that actually it also helps their event, Semana Santa. Also for the Christmas market, it seems to work. But this is Semana Santa. They have these floats. For a week, the city shuts down, and they have these old, very historic floats with sculptures by, Maria and Jesus and Christ sculptures. People are watching. There's a very special music. You can hear the breath of 20 people carrying this thing. Quite hard work, and they constantly have to change people who are carrying it underneath. But it's an honor to be part of that procession. Again, here the communication becomes really part of an urban experience. It's not only you're there, but you're also at the same time somewhere else. Here are some pictures of Semana Santa, concerts that are happening there, flamenco festivals that are happening. This is on the elevated plaza. Of course, there's a website or a Facebook page that shows what's going on, that markets that place into a different realm. I found it also on the internet in a couple of videos, music videos, so it seems to work for Latino pop that you see here, but also works for hip hop or rap. And it works for more cheesy Latino pop. This is the elevator cabin, or on top of it, here, the same guy. Also, Miss Spain had her photos taken just before the Miss Universe elections, which she didn't win this year. Then, there's public viewing, also that works really well and becomes kind of the hub for anything that's kind of a city celebration now. There was an action movie with a shooting that happened there. And also advertising seems to like it. So Mercedes got inspired, and this is a computer rendering, I think, where they used this kind of structure as an advertising for their car. But BMW was there, and Jeep was also there, and also Volkswagen. Also, it happens, to be on a couple of, let's say, cover pictures on social media. Also on guidebooks here, this is Lonely Planet for Seville. Then there was Gay Pride or the Cartoon Festival. And these were the moments which I think are the most successful ones, where the building already starts to be transformed into something else. So it just becomes an anchor or, let's say, a kick-off point for another transformation, another reading. And I think that's the beauty of it, when you see people are taking it and forming it something else. Then a couple of years later, it became even fashion. Now they also use it, for banking machines in Seville. Then there is, of course, souvenirs that we didn't design, but all kinds of, products that are trying to market even that part. There are painters on the street painting it now. There are certain action films and comic strips. This one I got this year, but it's already 2 years old. An Indian television show, sports show. I think they got inspired. And you see it here, it's kind of an Indian TV production. And also some other architecture that seems to kind of echo that part and transforms it now into other forms of buildings. This is one building I found, or another. It's kind of what I see, on competition online or competition documentations. Then there's other events like sports events happening, or political demonstrations. You have the forming of Podemos, which is the new left government or left party in Spain, and in Seville they use that site for their founding. You have also demonstrations, in this case for the new king when he was inaugurated, where people raised their voice. And the year when it was opened, it was the year of Revolución, or the Indignados, talking about the future of the society all over Seville, all over Spain, but also in Seville, in the very city center here on Metropol Parasol. This is where people of Sevilla are now discussing, or were discussing, about where is this culture going, where is our next generation going, what are the possibilities for our future, and creating Metropol Parasol as a place to discuss these different options. It's a place for talks and speeches and concerts. It's a place for workshops. In this case, the Parasol really defined or organized the demonstrations. One of the foots of the Parasol was the kitchen, another one was the Wi-Fi zone, the third one was kind of the workshop check-in area. So each foot actually had a different function or program within this 2-3 weeks of discussing about the future. And also in that time, you were allowed to sleep there, so even sleeping in public, which normally is considered somehow an indecent way of using the city, or maybe even violating kind of the regulations of a city. In this case, it was the centerpiece of sleep of Seville. The city itself created that space, that cover, to allow us to feel protected even at night. And I think that's the beauty of the project itself. It's a gift that the city government was giving to its citizens to actually celebrate community and celebrate a togetherness, which seems to work really well. And I all invite you to come to Seville at some point in the next couple of years and see how it really works in everyday life. So thank you so much. This was an honor to show the work. And also, Luis is speaking next, and I think it was important to see that the idea of heritage and contemporary architecture really is a dialogue that becomes an important field of investigation lately and will guide us in the next couple of years. Thank you. Yeah.
I try to take notes, and there are like some really interesting words or phrases. Okay, democracy and individual points, German glamour, that was really fun. Urban exploration, creating experience, sound pollution, earthquake behaviors, conference rooms above the checkpoint, that's also interesting. And one more, like my favorite, is normal country. And you can really, in your project as well, tell a difference between a normal country and a country on the way to maybe become a normal country. It's also the projects like Karlsruhe and Sevilla are really in the middle of the city and attracting, yes, locals as well, but also any kind of other attention. And I think what's really important is, as you said, is communication as part of urban experience and attracting attention through these, of course, medias, all kinds of medias that we have today. But I would like to know, like, how do you see the main difference between these projects and the projects you did in Georgia? Of course, these are like in the middle of nowhere and so on, but I believe they did not manage to create this kind of attraction through communication, through the media, as much as, of course, these projects. And we as architects all know about them, and I'm not so sure that like wider public does. So, I mean, these are completely different societies in a way as well. So how do you see this?
Well, somehow, Karlsruhe and the Volt project in Berlin are projects that are working on sites being affected through the Second World War still. So this is still something, a context that we are working with. In Karlsruhe, which seems to be the nice royal garden behind the castle, is actually a rebuilt castle. It burned down in the Second World War and had to be rebuilt. And when we were asked to design the pavilion, we had to be very careful with the landscape regulations because, you know, there are worms and there's nature and there's all these kind of wealth of animals in the ground. So we had to also control very carefully where we can set the building into the landscape or into the ground. Well, 2 months before we started construction, they made another research of the ground and found out that after 50 centimeters of earth, that was all full of rubble from the Second World War. So there was no possibility to do these screws into the ground. So it had to be a completely different foundation because it had this history that nobody seems to have documented and nobody seems to know about it. We were surprised that we weren't told, and it's not so long ago. But still, you know, you're confronted with these effects of a certain history, a recent history that is part of our everyday, you know, life as an architect. And in Berlin, it's somehow the division between the two cities and these kind of open areas of the center of Berlin that now, only now, like 60 years later, or even longer, have, you know, finally, you know, other forms of revival coming in. In Georgia, you know, to compare it with Georgia, I also sometimes make this comparison to a post-war Germany, but more of the 50s, where when, you know, Germany was rebuilt, we needed bus stations, we needed train stations, we needed new town halls. They all are from the 50s, most of them still. Until a couple of years ago, now they're transformed, but it was an urgency architecture that needed to be built to just have a certain infrastructure or a certain system being operating again. And it doesn't mean that they have to stand there forever, but they are very important for that moment, and they're speaking about that moment right now. In Germany, most of these 50s architectures are gone. You know, there's still some of them are surviving, but it's a moment of urgency that you see in architecture.
Thank you. Any questions?
You are a German architect, it's a Far West, and yet you have a lot of projects in Georgia that's like Far East. So I have actually two questions about that. First one would be like, how difficult it is for you to design projects abroad? How difficult it is for you to project something that you know that you won't be able to come to the site as often as if you would go if it was in Germany? How difficult it is to cooperate with people that are a couple hundred miles away from you? And how difficult it is to design something that when you bounce into a problem, you cannot solve it immediately because it's so far away, because it's how difficult it is to have a connection, to have communication with people in that way.
Well, nowadays with our digital communication, it's not so difficult as maybe it was in earlier times. But each project actually has its own dynamics. Sometimes it's easier to communicate, sometimes it's more difficult and you have to fight for being updated. Sometimes you have to let go and there's a new dynamic that happens on site with people who take over and realizing it. I don't think we are necessarily very, let's say, control obsessed. You know, of course, we have our ideas that we would like to do it, and if we would do it all in our way, we would have a certain way to do it. But there are other projects where there's a dialogue, there's a certain exchange that's happening, and that's also especially the case with Georgia. The idea of bringing in international architects a couple of years ago, it changed now, but a couple of years ago was that there is an input coming into the country, and there is a certain learning that we as international architects dealing with these countries can happen. At the same time, the local architects were exposed to a different way of thinking of architecture and also understanding how certain ideas can be translated into other forms of construction. So it was a dialogue that happened, you know, from both sides. And some of them were more successful, sometimes were not so successful. But I think it's a moment of, it's an adventure where you don't really know what the result will be. And the design process somehow is not so different than our design process in other countries. There's a certain way we look at the site or at the program. There's a certain, let's say, expertise or naiveness, it depends how you want to call it, how to design a building. And I don't think it was different in Georgia than in Germany. Maybe the complexities were a little bit different, or let's say the ways how we communicate it, but the architecture, I don't think, has a different agenda behind it. We were, I think, maybe more liberated, and the distance helped also to somehow be more risky. At the same time, also, we knew we had a certain support from the client to make an architecture that is actually provoking, that is showing that there's a certain innovation, while in Germany we are more fighting the other direction, which is trying to tame down sometimes to even start to have a dialogue with the city board or the client or something like that. So it's different forms of exploring the boundaries of your architectural expressions.
The other question? And the other question also responds a little to the civil project.
Sorry?
But that also responds a little to the civil project, but actually you already partly answered it. How, when you work abroad, how difficult it is to make a project that reacts to the cultural heritage of the country? When, if you're an architect who has a little experience with their culture, do you think you can create a good enough object? Do you think you can respond well enough to their culture, to their heritage, to their laws, to their obligations, to the way they live, to the way they think, to the way they create? Do you think you can create something that fits into that space?
How do I think I answered this?
Any way you like.
No, how did I answer it already? No, I mean in Seville it was a competition, so it's actually not even my decision if they like it or not. You know, it's actually their decision if they like it or not. But I was there in '92 during the World Expo, and I remembered the heat, and I remembered that roof of the cathedral. And these were very, let's say, momentary memories or momentary inputs that actually led into this whole process. And of course, there's a certain history of your design methodology or a kind of a certain trust in this insecurity of trying to find an architecture that might work on certain sites or that works with certain progress in projects and programs. But in the end, you know, it might be more successful or not. In this case, I think it was successful, otherwise we wouldn't have won the competition. And it also echoed, let's say, the positive response from the people in Seville.
Yeah, but at the Far East, Georgia, I mean, the Georgian culture is so very different than the German. It's like the Caucasian people, the Caucasian villages. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to their culture? I mean,
well, I think with the architecture we saw, and there are certain elements that we find very interesting. Some of them came from the program and rethinking the program, and also showing that there's a different way of looking at certain conventions and conditions. For example, the border station, you know, being not articulated as a borderline that separates, but as a place to come together, I think is a way to respond to these regulations and also to a different understanding how the country wants to be seen.
Thank you.
I mean, just related comment. I mean, seeing Seville site as a place of innovation, or seeing Karlsruhe site as an important place of World War II, and in relation to the heritage, but not looking really too much at the houses around. I mean, yes, we architects maybe use this somehow, but I think these questions come to like really more important, and these issues are more important than, you know, something that locals maybe really exaggerate at some point.
Well, I mean, if we talk about what Bastian said yesterday about architectural language and its context, sorry to interrupt, it's, you know, basically there's a couple of strategies that I see reappearing in our work, and some of them are issues of scale. So if there's something that we find interesting in a certain location, for example, the undulated roof or some, you know, the forest or an artificial forest as a strategy to design something, by taking these elements and enlarging them, making them kind of overexposed, and then folding all other aspects into that, you know, first initial, let's say, scale question, is part of a system of design strategies in our work, I think. There's a certain abstraction where we try to disguise elements, like stairs or windows, more into part of the sculptural element, and therefore you create also an issue of scaleness as an object quality, a sculpture quality that comes with it. Quite often we deal with issues of extrusion, where there's a certain silhouette that gets kind of projected into the depth. So there are some things that come back, you know, as tools in the design process. But usually they're taking something that we find interesting or important for a certain site or location and making that an overexpressed gesture that then folds in all the other aspects. It gets fine-tuned by other details.
Thank you.
Just
so, hello.
Just to say hello. No, it's a simple question. You've been starting the story about Georgia with that you were invited along other architects, and I just wanted to ask what happened to the other architects.
Oh, the other architects actually built much bigger buildings. Yeah, you have Fuksas, who built the big town hall in Tbilisi and kind of a cultural center and an exhibition space. That's the one when we were contacted for the first time to actually work on that. I think our designs were too complicated and looked too expensive. But most of these projects that we saw have different clienteles. For example, the mobile phone company in Georgia, they are allowed to do business, but at the same time they actually have to also invest into some kind of public project. So that's what the Fuksas project is about, this open air and museums project. The pavilion, the first one I showed, is a construction company who I think was doing road work in Georgia. So by getting the job for the road work, they also had to build a social place or cafe space in Batumi. If somebody wants to invest into a pipeline, then they're also kind of forced or invited to also build something for for vitalization of city and a kind of communal life. So this was part of, I think, the business plan that Georgia had. So Michael Luki is one of the architects. UN Studio built an airport. Wandelhöfer Hirsch built a office shopping complex. Graf built a hotel there. So you have a lot of architects doing something.
One more question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I haven't seen, maybe it was intentionally, but I haven't seen people on the projects in Georgia. So I'm interested, how did they accept it? And if you were invited in Georgia, I suppose that you cooperated with government. So how do you see your responsibility in kind of helping their architectural procedure being more transparent and kind of involving more local community, since we see that in Sevilla that was like a main thing what kind of boosted this project to be publicly more accepted. So how do you, can you help their government to understand what's the importance of this kind of approach, transparent approach? And the first question, how the public in Georgia related to these new landmarks? Thanks.
Well, in terms of photography, I think it's something that I see also now in the more I show the Sevilla project and see how it actually lives with people, I'm missing the people in the other photography, and I think that's something that was kind of changing, with Ivan Bahn and other photographers, Bas Prince, and you see for many years people actually being part of the architectural documentation. But I think it's something, when I now look at architecture, I'm missing it actually. And in Seville, the contrast was quite intense this morning with, let's say, photography that is quite remote and empty. Usually there are people in these buildings, and I should go back and have it documented with people. People like it, and it's really nicely accepted, especially the rest stops and also the border station work really well. But most of the projects, I was invited for the first project through the government, so there was a lot of support from the government for our work, and this is why they saw a certain value in the architectural contribution that we could bring to the country. And the same with other architects also who were invited. So I think the acceptance really works, but there's still kind of, when I talk to Georgians, there's still a younger generation who is really well educated and looks, towards kind of a potential of being part of a global world, and an older part of the society who is missing this network and this kind of lobby work that they were doing, and so successfully doing until maybe 10, 12 years ago. So there's a big discrepancy between two understandings how the country should run.
The Rubies had this book for MVRDV where they invited people to take photos of their objects. So maybe you can have them do it. Okay, thank you, Jürgen. That was great.